Leading off our discussion tonight, Jared Bernstein, a CNBC contributor and the former chief economist and economic policy advisor to Vice President Biden. Lynette Lopez is senior financial correspondent at Business Insider. Jennifer Rubin is an opinion writer at The Washington Post and an MSNBC contributor. Jared Bernstein, you've seen a lot in your life and work in politics and in business, in economics. The president starting a war with his Federal Reserve chief, comparing him to the leader of an authoritarian nation, is something I've never seen.
Yeah, I got to say, I don't pay close attention to a lot of what Trump says because it's often meaningless. But that one just got deeply under my skin, much as I sense it did yours and hopefully many of our viewers as well. I have known Jerome Powell for a while before he went over to the Federal Reserve. This is a guy who's been a thoughtful and dedicated public servant for as long as I've known him. And for Trump, who is, as you've said, delivering the chaos and the crazy at a rate that's massively accelerated from what was already too much to take. For him to come after Powell that way is it's beyond norm breaking. It's just reprehensible. And as you also correctly pointed out, just kind of getting back to the economics, now he's taking his chaos to Europe to meet with other international leaders. And look, based on what we've seen, I don't see how that ends well.
Jennifer Rubin, it's like Pigpen. He's got a swirling cloud of chaos around him, literally, to the extent that the G7, I've never even heard of this before. I've covered G7s. I've never heard that they've decided before the whole thing started that they're not putting out a joint communique, because there's no point. They're not going to agree on anything. The New York Times talks today about President Trump. He said Mr. Trump's wild and unscripted pronouncements on Friday renewed questions about his stewardship of the world's largest economy. Even some of his own aides and allies were alarmed by his behavior, seeing it as the flailing of a president increasingly anxious over the dark clouds that some have detected hovering over the economy. Jennifer, we were all there for 2008, and none of us want to be there again. But if, when recession comes, because it is likely it will, what we don't need is chaos at the helm.
Exactly. President Trump has always thrived on chaos. He thinks it puts his opponents on their back heel. He thinks that somehow makes him the big guy because he's able to come in and clear up the chaos that he started. This does not work this way when you're president of the United States. It sure doesn't work this way when you're playing games with the international trade system. It sure doesn't make that any sense when you're starting to shoot out decrees that the businesses of America will cease doing business with China. You know, I think his insult that the Democrats are all a bunch of socialists kind of went out the window with that, because that's kind of a Stalinist decree. He, of course, does not have the power. But who knows what he's going to do next? Who knows what executive order he will issue? Who knows what court fights American businesses are going to be in? And the shame of this is Congress could prevent every bit of this. The power of regulating trade and tariffs resides with Congress. They have legislated that away, and they could take that back hook, line, and sinker, even a national security excuse, which he has exemption, which he has abused. And they are too chicken to do this. They could save the economy, and they won't. So when this economy does falter, it's not only going to be Trump's fault, it's going to be the Republicans in Congress who have not the absolute 1 ounce of energy, of spine to do anything about this.
Lynette, there's so much wrong with that hereby thing that he did today. He said our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China.
Yeah,
there's a lot wrong there.
If there's anything American CEOs love to do, it's take orders from a trust fund baby, casino bankrupting, reality TV rodeo clown. I mean, I'm sure that they're loving. I'm sure they're loving it, and it's not legal. And I'm sure that that there will be reactions in the business community that will be very quiet. But business investment has gone down. That is speaking very loudly to the president. The manufacturing sector is slowing down, and the tariffs that he is about to enact will hit the consumer. The next round.
No, they won't, because China pays for it.
Oh, right. That's I forgot. We live in a crazy land now. But yeah, so next round we're hitting retail. Round after that, you're hitting, toys, etc. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where the rubber hits the flat screen TVs in December, and in September it's going to be the sneakers, the jeans, etc. The American consumer is keeping the global economy afloat right now. This is the last thing that you want to do. And frankly, he's laying out a path to destruction. The thing that also worries me is that Chairman Powell seems to be internalizing some of what Trump is saying. He was talking about the Fed's responsibility to keep the expansion going. That's like the governor of Florida saying that hurricane season is canceled. Recessions happen. They're cyclical. Trump may have gotten maybe he had some bad luck, but he's turning that bad luck into disaster with this trade situation.
Jared, at the top of the show, I was saying that this is a lose-lose situation. Those aren't actually my words. They're actually your words. You said this to me last week. You said this is the worst kind of war because everybody's losing on every front. We will not get the soybean contracts back that we had with China because they are now getting that soybean from Brazil. The lobsters that we're not selling to China, they're getting from Canada now. The fact is we'll never get 100% of it back. Farmers lose money. Americans spend more on stuff. The Chinese are suffering more than we are. And there's no articulated view of what success is here.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the only way to win a trade war is to not be in one. And in fact, what you're starting to hear some of these businesses saying is that they have tried, in many cases, to find new production platforms from which they can import the goods that are now facing increasing tariffs in China. And it's just really hard to do. And by the way, note that that does not accomplish Trump's goal. Trump's goal is some version of import substitution, meaning build stuff domestically that's being currently built abroad. That's not what we're hearing these producers saying. They're saying, well, okay, maybe I'll go to Cambodia, to Vietnam, to India, to Malaysia. And it's very hard to shift those supply chains. And that's why we're having some of the economic problems that Lynette was just talking about, including diminished investment. Now, I think the idea was that if you look at any article that was about a potential recession in the wind over the last couple of weeks, they all mentioned the trade war in paragraph 1 as Exhibit A of Trump really damaging the economy. That was before this level of escalation and this market reaction today. So whatever that kind of recession risk factor that's going on, it has now been amped up by the president.
So Jennifer Rubin, there's all sorts of talk. There's people accusing the media of amping up the idea of a recession. There's people saying the Democrats want a recession because it'll put Trump out of office. Let's be clear here. Anybody wishing for a recession is just got a black heart. But the fact is they do happen, and there is nothing that is going to affect Donald Trump's base or erode his support more than people actually losing jobs and losing their wages, which actually happens in a recession. So I would think for all of the dozens of things over the last 2 years that we have heard Republicans stay silent about, I would think this would be the one they'd say, no, hold on a second. You cannot run this train right off the tracks because we'll all lose the next election.
Well, I somewhat casually sent off a tweet today. How many points does the Dow have to drop before the Republicans get into the game? 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. What is it going to finally take to get them off the stick? And I think part of the problem here is not only is this a complete mess, but way back when, do you remember we actually had a real problem with China, which was the theft, the extortion of our intellectual property?
That's actually the thing that we should have dealt with, and the entire world would have supported the United States in dealing with.
And we could have signed on to TPP, which excluded China, put the pressure on China, cemented our alliances. So we have done just about everything wrong to not only not solve our old problems, but create new ones. And by the way, one thing we haven't discussed is as they have rejiggered the jobs numbers for the last couple of years, turns out there's 500,000 less jobs created than we thought. So this tax cut, which was supposed to land us in plus 3%, 3% plus land,
Yeah.
hasn't done that. It looks a lot weaker than we even suspected it was. And as a result of that, what's he going to use now?
Yeah.
We already have $1 trillion deficit. What's he going to use as a fiscal stimulus if we go into a depression? The Fed, yes, has cut rates, but they're so low already. There's not that much room on the monetary side. So pray tell, how do you get the economy out of the ditch if Trump drives it into one?
Lynette?
Well, the thing that concerns me about what he was saying is that it seems like he's let go of making a deal, and now his goal is what we call in, nerd circles, decoupling with China, which is just severing the economic relationship between the United States and China, which would be horrific, and which many worry would divide the world between an economic and digital iron curtain. And you'd really have to choose between two internets, two economies, two worlds. I don't think we want that again. And what he seems to be moving toward full steam ahead, if he can't get his way from President Xi, like a screaming, pouting child, is that he's going to pull for this decoupling notion. And
He said it today. He tweeted it out today.
It's very scary.
Jared, explain why that's really tough, because it's not just that we buy stuff that's manufactured. This is not a normal relationship that we would have described 20 years ago where we're buying manufactured goods from China. The relationship with China is substantially more complicated than that from a currency perspective, from an investment perspective, and from what China does around the world.
So Donald Trump thinks that he can unscramble the globalization omelet, and he can't. It's not just that we import toys and televisions from China. We also import tons of intermediate goods. These are imports that go into products that are produced here. So our linkages to the Chinese economy are not just the kind of stuff that's on the shelves of Walmart. And even them, as I said in my last remark, those goods are not going to be made here. The globalization ship has left the port, and now, as I mentioned, those producers are looking to import from other countries, often in Asia. So, A, the notion of import substitution that will just replace all that stuff domestically, it's just not going to happen. That's just not the structure of the global economy. And B, you're really hurting American producers. It's just what you said at the beginning of the show. Now, the farmers are getting hurt by retaliation, but it's actually American producers using intermediate imports in their production from China that took the first hit, and it's continuing to deepen.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.